Funding for this program was provided in part by the Lastinger Family Foundation, the Huff Family Foundation, Weaver Family Foundation Fund through the Community Foundation for Northeast Florida, and the Joy McCann Foundation, a production of Small Planet Pictures Incorporated, Investigative Media Group Incorporated, and 1186 Pictures. In association with the University of Florida, Historic St. Augustine Incorporated, and 13 Productions, LLC, for WNET. Funding for Secrets of the Dead is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Next Tuesday, December 26th at 9 p.m., New Mexico PBS will air Secrets of Spanish Florida, a Secrets of the Dead special. The documentary features a team of archaeologists, scientists, and historians as they reveal the little-known history of America's Spanish colonists who settled Florida in 1565, long before Jamestown or Plymouth. New Mexico, however, has its own history of Spanish colonists and indigenous populations. The Spanish established settlements here long before the English settled in the East. And according to the late Pueblo historian Joe Sando, you could call New Mexico's Pueblo Revolt of 1680 the first American Revolution. While the uprising may not be widely known outside of our state, the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico and the return of the Spanish afterwards is living history. The fact that the line just talked about this year's Entrada reenactment is proof. Correspondent Antonia Gonzalez sits down with two experts that are closely connected to delving into the histories of early Florida and of New Mexico.
Here with me today are Dr. Kathleen Deegan, Distinguished Research Curator of Archaeology and Adjunct Professor of Anthropology and History at the University of Florida's Florida Museum of Natural History. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Dr. Amy Villarreal, Director of Comparative Mexican American Studies at Our Lady of the Lake University, a Santa Fe native. She was formerly a visiting research scholar at the Southwest Hispanic Research Center at UNM. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And Kathy, you appear in the documentary Secrets of Spanish Florida. Can you give us an overview of the program and tell us about the discovery you and your team made?
Well, the program was originally designed as a commemoration of the 450th anniversary of St. Augustine's founding, which was in 1565. And it ran over, as I guess a lot of productions do, and it became a 4-hour series on really with two themes. One was to try and bring attention to the fact that people of Spanish background were part of American history very early on and part of America's colonial past. And the other was to try and communicate the idea that in these early Spanish settlements, New Mexico as well as Florida, there was a social mixture. It was a multivocal and multicultural and intermarried, and it probably looked a lot more like America today than the rest of America at that time. But it was a long process, and I'm an archaeologist and had been working for many years in St. Augustine, and we were able to finally locate the site, the original site of St. Augustine, where Menendez came in 1565. And so that was pretty exciting and was a small focus of the film.
The settlements show that the Spanish established a colony in America before some European settlements further up north. Tell us about that distinction.
Well, one of my colleagues, the late Michael Gannon, loves to say that when Jamestown was founded, St. Augustine was up for urban renewal. And it was 72 years before Jamestown, and there was a thriving community of people with towns and fortresses, and it has been largely ignored in mainstream American history in much the same way that a lot of the very early events in New Mexico have been.
And Amy, New Mexico also had Spanish explorers here who encountered indigenous populations and a colony that was established here as well. As a researcher and producer of the film Frontera, tell us about that story and about the film.
So Frontera is a cartoon. It's a 20-minute cartoon, and the director is John J. Leaños. He is a professor of social documentation at UC Santa Cruz. And we met because I was at UC Santa Cruz as well and ended up working on the film. And so what we tried to do with the film was tell a people's history of New Mexico. And the late historian, or the historian Joe Sando, he said that the Pueblo Revolt is the first American Revolution. And that's not very well known. And so as part of the shared history, of this region, we decided to make a film using the voices of people from New Mexico, also incorporating art and artwork from Pueblo artists, and also recruiting talent and voices like Conroy Chino and Limo Quino and Andrea Serrano to do the voices and speak as we do. And so it was kind of the history we hold in our heads and not really the capital H history, as there are many voices and many ways to tell that story.
And here in New Mexico, the Pueblo Revolt in the 1600s was an indigenous stand against the colonists coming in. Do you see that history commonly told outside of New Mexico?
No, as a matter of fact, that's the reason why we made the film, was to show that this indigenous uprising, which actually against the Spanish Empire, was actually, one of the very successful ones. And of course, there was indigenous and African slave revolts throughout the settlement, right, of what we now call the Americas. So this isn't a unique event, but it was quite successful in casting out the Spanish Empire for 12 years. And I think the most interesting part, in which the film does not tell, is what happened after, and the 12-year interim period when the Pueblos remade themselves and built cities of refuge on top of high mesas and reorganized themselves. And there were people of different tribes living in these cities, and there was a new pan-Indian identity being forged that wasn't present at the time. The revolt also involved mulattoes and mestizo people, and also people who grew up in the missions, people that are sometimes referred to as Ladinos. And so it was really a mixed revolution. I think that's why we can really say, and Joe Sando is correct in saying it was the first American Revolution. And I think the story of the secrets of Spanish Florida also shows that there were other kinds of communities forged in the Americas that are kind of left out of the grand narrative of American history, a type of historical amnesia, I suppose, that erases these other worlds that were possible and continue to be possible as, it's part of our continuance. I mean, we're still here, of course.
And Kathy, add on to that about, Amy was saying, the untold stories, or maybe stories that are not highlighted across the country. What is your hope?
Well, there are untold stories, I think, probably everywhere, but no more so than in places of Spanish colonization, partly because of language. And I think what Amy said is correct, that it has to do with attitudes toward race and inclusion and otherness. But in Spanish Florida, for example, we learned archaeologically that if you went into a household of a Spanish identified colonist, to say a Spanish soldier and his family, almost everything in terms of pottery and household activity would be Native American or African in its origin and preparation and form and the type of pottery. And this was not something that anyone had ever really underscored at all, either here or in the Anglo colonies. And it seems that in these areas of Spanish colonization, there was a pretty immediate incorporation of particularly Indian women and intermarriage, which was not frowned upon at all. It was really the impediment was religion, if you weren't Catholic, rather than race or origin. And my colleagues in the English colonies were aghast. They couldn't believe it, because when you look at English colonial homes of the same time period, there is no trace of an American Indian or an African in the daily life of households. So we really think that it's in the households and the agency of Indian women that a lot of our early colonial development occurred. And there were also a lot of rebellions, nothing on the scale of the Pueblo Revolt. In Florida in the 17th and 16th century, the Wali people rose up against the missionaries, the Timucua, but they were not as successful, and they only drove the Spaniards away for a matter of months. No one is very aware of the Native American cacicas. A lot of the leaders were women, and through them, conversion took place. So there are a lot of, as you said, different ways to tell the story and different voices to say it.
Right.
And Amy, what are your thoughts on our young people today? They're the ones that are really, learning in schools, history books, also from their families and Indigenous people with their tribes. Why is it important to have the Indigenous view, which is often left out?
Well, I think that it's very important. Not only are these the first peoples, right, of the Americas, but also because our young people need positive representations of themselves and their communities in school. They need to see themselves in textbooks. They need to learn about the complexities of this history, and that there's other histories besides the Mayflower and the grand narrative that we often learn about. And of course, that's part of the story too. But they need to see that their ancestors were part of making this nation. And I think it's very important, mostly for Native kids and also for people of Mexican American descent, to see, because our communities are often disparaged in the media or misrepresented, right, in cartoons or in films or in westerns, and to see that we were part of a forging of communities here, communities in difference, right, is very important for us to see that people that didn't know each other, were able to live together, that people intermarried, that people were able to resolve their differences. People were able to go through extreme moments of violence and crisis and come through it together somehow. And I think that those are very empowering stories of collective resistance and also collective moving forward, as we say, continuance. And these are very inspirational for our kids to know. And I think that we can serve some of these stories in our own families. But it shouldn't just be in the private space of the home. This should be essential to our curriculum. And unfortunately, Mexican American studies, Native studies, ethnic studies in general is so marginalized within public schools and also within universities. It's difficult for these classes to make. Every time there's some kind of crisis in the university, we're the first classes to get cut. And so that says that this marginalized knowledge continues to be marginalized, even though most of us understand its importance.
And Kathy, to add to that, not only both these projects including diverse voices, what about the significance of having advisors from these different communities in on the project?
Well, it's absolutely essential for that very reason you just said. And it was a little bit of a problem or difficulty in Florida because tragically there are no representatives of the people, the original people in Florida today. And the Seminole really are serving as the advisors on all sorts of matters that related to the other tribes. But there's a lot more emphasis, I think, in the East on the plight and the role of early African colonists. And we always hear that they were here first in 1619, but in fact they came as free colonists and soldiers with Pedro Menendez de Aviles in 1565 and before that. So that is another important element of adding to the advisory panels and getting perspectives from everybody whose stories are really shaped by what happened in the past. And I think everyone sees their story as important for some reasons, and people looking at those stories from the outside may have other reasons. And for that reason alone, and the need for multivocality, it's important to have as many people as possible involved.
And just to add on the African presence, it's so important to understand that with every expedition, with every, Spanish colonization, there were always Africans, Moroccans, people who were conversos or had converted to Catholicism, who were primarily grown up as Muslims. And so that adds to the religious diversity as well, and also Jews who had been cast out or had been converted. And recently, they did a census in Mexico of the African population, or people who identified themselves as Afro-Mexican, and they came up with about 1.5 million people, which was actually surprising for many. And that just shows that, the African presence is also very important and one of the areas that gets erased as well.
And it's important, too, in the topic of resistance and rebellion. Some of the earliest rebellions against colonial injustice were African people brought here unwillingly. And we were discussing earlier, the first free black American settlement, which is in St. Augustine, and was a consequence of African slaves in the Carolinas fleeing and resisting slavery almost immediately after Charleston was founded. And Spain had a policy of giving sanctuary to any slaves who escaped from the British areas and agreed to become Catholic. And they gave them a place in the militia, and they built their own fort and town adjacent to St. Augustine in the early 1700s, which is the earliest legally sanctioned free African settlement in the United States, although there were other settlements, Maroons and runaways. But I think that's another critical story, and people, I think, are even less aware of the role of Africans in New Mexico.
Right. Well, thank you both so much for being with us today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Yes.
We heard Dr. Villarreal talk about the animated film Frontera, Revolt and Rebellion on the Rio Grande, which traces the events that led to the uprising. You can find a link to that video on our webpage, newmexicoinfocus.org. Now let's see a bit of that film in a clip, which tells the story about the Pueblo Revolt itself in a very unconventional way.
By 1675, the Upper Rio Grande was in crisis. The Spanish Inquisition, sexual violations by soldiers and priests, drought, hunger, and the struggle for power between Spanish clergy and soldiers all led to extreme actions.
I opened my eyes, 1675, el Rio Grande, en crisis, abuse of lives. Los soldados y los padres abusando a las madres del pueblo. Miro para arriba, miro sangre en el cielo. Mataron al curandero, quemaron mi kiva, mi vida le vale huevo, but I was born a rebel. El conquistador, the Spanish Inquisition, the cities of gold, the murderous mission. Can't practice my culture, destroyed by a vulture, forced into hunger. A gun sounds like thunder. Indigenous accused, now how long will this last? When the Kachina dances are viewed as witchcraft, revolt in secret, rebellious we get. Massacre my people, we gon' make you regret. Revolution is the solution. No oppression, freedom the lesson. Inquisition, power position. But we are blessed in the ways of the legends. Revolution is the solution. No oppression, freedom the lesson. Inquisition, power position. But we are blessed in the ways of the legends. Popeye had the vision and the people made decision. We must unite the tribes and break free from this prison. Churches ablaze with the warrior face. We must uplift the race. No matter what's the case, we're gonna take back what's ours and don't leave one detalle. Van a ver que la sangre se derrama por las calles hasta que grita un auxilio, socorro, nunca me corro. My people, we wonder how we survive to stay alive through droughts and hunger. The thunder and rain will wash us again. The survival is tribal, a union is vital. We can stand up to any type of challenge. And one day again we'll see that our lives are in balance. Goya Naskatsi, we raise a posse. Tewatiwa, Dano, Toazuni, and Hopi. We won't be beaten and abused. Together we refuse the revolution. Fist you lose. Culture is critical. Rise of the spiritual. The hands of the creator are strong and invisible. We light this so that our people can see through the darkest crisis. Our spirits are priceless. Through the centuries we remain connected to the ancestors gone and disrespected. It's time to learn a lesson.
Revolution is the solution. No oppression, freedom the lesson. Inquisition, power, position. But we are blessed in the ways of the legends.
Popeye retreats to a cave at Taos Pueblo to pray. As Popeye emerges, he shares a prophetic vision of unified Pueblos and a spiritual return to the old ways. With Popeye, Tewa and Northern Tewa leaders began planning a rebellion in secret. They sent runners to communicate messages on painted hides and knotted cords. Mixed-race mestizo allies who knew the Spanish intimately joined in to create a blueprint for revolution. First, they would rise up against the Spaniards, killing as many as possible, burning the churches and driving off the horses and cattle. Second, they would close all the roads, isolating the capital at Santa Fe. Third, a pan-Pueblo army would descend upon the governor's palace, offering them an ultimatum: leave or die. On August 9, 1680, word of the revolt reached the governor in Santa Fe. By evening, the Pueblos knew their plan had been discovered. Leaders sent runners with an urgent message to rise up immediately, 2 days before the planned revolt. Deep into the night, the runners raced through back desert trails. As the runners arrived, the Pueblos rose up one by one.
Revolution is the solution. No oppression, freedom the lesson.
But the Spanish were overcome by the warriors. The survivors fled the Upper Rio Grande, retreating to El Paso del Norte. The revolt was complete. Victory was at hand. The people went to the Great River to cleanse themselves of the recent past. Many abandoned their mission villages and built new communities on ancient sites and upon high mesas. The Pueblos, once again, prayed in their kivas and danced their sacred dances, and the people were very much pleased. Back at El Paso del Norte, the Spanish planned the Reconquista. 12 years later, the sun would be set ablaze upon snow-covered mesas, and the icy rivers would run red once again.